Do you know what scares a manipulator the most? Not when you get angry, not when you cry, not even when you cut off contact with them. What worries them most is when you start asking the right questions. It sounds ridiculously simple, but think about it. A manipulator is like a magician. As long as the audience is looking where they're pointing, the performance continues. But the moment someone looks directly at the trick, things start to get awkward. And that's why manipulators are often very comfortable when you're emotional, but extremely uncomfortable when you're sober. Many people think manipulation is something very complex. In reality, it's largely just the art of manipulating other people's perceptions. A manipulator doesn't necessarily have to be stronger than you, smarter than you, or more powerful than you. They just need to make you doubt yourself. And unfortunately, this is far more effective than we'd like to admit. They make you feel guilty for things that aren't your fault. They force you to explain perfectly reasonable decisions. They turn your boundaries into selfishness. They turn your self-preservation into indifference. And after a while, you start wondering if you're really the problem. That's when the first question becomes incredibly dangerous for them. A simple but terrifying question. Why do you always change the story when things aren't going your way? Interestingly, manipulators often love to talk. They love to explain. They love to tell stories. They love to steer the conversation toward their advantage. But when asked to explain inconsistencies, they often lose their advantage. Because manipulation works best in ambiguity. It needs vague details. It needs gray areas. It needs emotion. When you start demanding clarity, the game becomes much more difficult. You'll notice something quite funny. When faced with this question, many manipulative people don't answer directly. They change the subject. They bring up the past. They drag others into the conversation. They bring up your mistakes from 3 years ago as if they just happened this morning. That's because the goal was never to find the truth. The goal was to make you forget the original question. The second question is even more irritating to them. It's, why is the blame always on someone else? Notice manipulative people. They are rarely the villain in their own story. They are always the victim. Colleagues don't understand them. Family doesn't support them. Friends betray them. Lovers hurt them. Bosses treat them badly. Even the weather seems to be against them. After a while, you start to notice a strange pattern. Everyone is wrong, only they are right. Psychology calls this avoidance of responsibility, because admitting fault means having to change, and change is something many manipulators are unwilling to do. It's much easier to blame circumstances. It's much easier to make yourself a perpetual victim. That way, they don't need to look at the behaviors creating the problem. They just keep telling the same story with different characters. Stoic people understand that maturity begins with responsibility. Not power, not control, not winning every argument, but the ability to look at their lives and say, what part of this is my responsibility? A person who can do that is very difficult to manipulate because they are not afraid of the truth. And that's what makes manipulators most uncomfortable. But if the first two questions make them lose their composure, the third question often makes the whole charade begin to crumble. And that's when many people first see the true person behind the mask they've worn for so long. The third question is so simple that many people overlook its power. It's, do you want to resolve this issue or just make me feel guilty? It sounds normal, but to a manipulator, it's like turning on a light in a dark room. Because many manipulative tactics aren't actually aimed at resolving the problem, they're aimed at creating emotions. More specifically, feelings of guilt, anxiety, pressure, or obligation. When you feel guilty, you're more likely to give in. When you feel anxious, you're more likely to agree. When you start doubting yourself, you're more likely to be controlled. That's why many arguments with a manipulator feel strange. You enter the conversation to resolve a specific issue. But somehow, 30 minutes later, you're apologizing for something completely unrelated. You want to talk about their broken promise. In the end, you have to explain why your tone sounded unpleasant last week. You want to talk about some inappropriate behavior on their part. Ultimately, you're asked why you didn't sufficiently understand their feelings. It feels like getting into a taxi to go home, but ending up being taken to a different city. Manipulators are very good at diverting attention. They understand that if the conversation stays on topic, they might be at a disadvantage. So they create smoke. They create distractions. They create emotions. And many people unknowingly walk into that labyrinth without realizing it. This is why the third question is so effective. It pulls the conversation back to the center. It forces everyone to look at the real goal of the discussion. Interestingly, when these questions arise, the reaction is often more important than the answer. An emotionally mature person might not like being questioned, but they will still try to answer. A manipulator usually reacts differently. They become unusually angry. They mock the question. They attack the questioner. They try to make you feel that asking the question is the problem, and that's the clearest sign. When someone fears clarity more than disagreement, they're probably benefiting from confusion. Stoic people have long understood that power doesn't lie in controlling others. Power lies in not letting others control your mind. That's why they don't spend all day trying to change manipulators. They focus on identifying them. They understand that some people don't want honest conversation. They want advantage. Some people don't want solutions. They want control. And once you see that, a lot starts to become clear. This doesn't mean you have to be suspicious of everyone. It also doesn't mean that anyone who disagrees with you is a manipulator. Life isn't that simple. But it does mean you should pay attention to recurring patterns. Adults can make mistakes. Manipulators turn mistakes into strategies. Adults can be defensive sometimes. Manipulators live in a state of constant defense, and that difference is crucial. Ultimately, manipulators aren't really afraid of your anger. They're not so afraid of you raising your voice. What they fear is you starting to see things calmly, clearly, and purposefully. Because the moment you stop reacting emotionally and start asking the right questions, you're no longer easily manipulated. And perhaps the biggest lesson here is this. Sometimes the most powerful way to defend yourself isn't to talk more, but to ask a question that leaves the other person nowhere to hide from the truth. And the most thought-provoking question is, in your recent conflicts, was someone trying to solve the problem, or were they just trying to control how you perceived it?